What's happening, guys? Ryan here from GTR Projects. Today we're looking at this customer's compressor. He has seized it due to not adding any oil upon receiving it. So we decided we're going to fix it for him. Here we are removing the outside motor cowling. Fairly simple process. Just take the 4 self-tapping screws out. Using a Phillips screwdriver. So here we pulling it off. One thing you've got to take off at the top there is the thermal overload protection switch. It's just a plastic screw which you undo with your hand, and then you can remove the cowling. As you can see, the 1-cylinder head there is actually broken. It came back to us from the courier like that, so presumably it's been dropped. So we'll tackle each cylinder slightly different. Well, the cylinder with the head that's intact we'll take off as one complete unit, and the side with the broken cylinder head we'll split apart. As you can see, taking off the 4 cylinder head bolts. It's just a 10mm socket, and remove them fairly simply. Here we are just undoing the pipework at the top. I used an adjustable spanner, as there's quite a few different size threads around the compressors. Quite handy to just have one of them around. Now you can remove the cylinder head. As you can see, it's broken off, and that reveals the valve plate assembly. And releasing the other side. Right. So release. So as you can see, the cylinder head on this side is still intact. We're going to take the whole cylinder and head off in one complete unit. No need to separate them and disturb the gasket if not needed. So just using a 90-degree angled Allen key, a rubber mallet just to knock it free. Slightly a little bit more tedious, but it's better than removing the entire better than splitting the head from the cylinder, as I said before. Right, and here she comes loose from the piston. I'll inspect it a bit to make sure there's no issues there. So what happened is the compressor ran without oil, and what happens on these is the conrod mating surfaces where the conrod meets the crankshaft run dry, and basically seizes up. So we need to gain access to the internals so we can remove and replace them. Here we're removing the other cylinder using Allen key socket. So Sean over there, he's helping out as usual. Fairly straightforward process this so far. Right, should be loose now. Be gentle when you pull it off of the pistons. You want to try to keep it straight and true so you don't damage the piston rings. Right. The next thing that needs to happen is the sump cover needs to come off. That's 3 10mm sockets. Sean's busy removing that there. And I will be taking off the fan. A nice pair of circlip pliers to remove the circlip which retains the fan in place. And then a pry bar will push the fan off the main shaft. The reason I'm doing this is so I can access the main shaft with a pair of vice grips, mole grips, which allows me to hold the main shaft in a position or move it about as need be to release the conrods from the crankshaft. So just to protect the shaft, just add a little piece of duct tape, and just a gentle grip. You don't want to force the vice grips on full force, or you might damage the shaft slightly. Here we're just draining the remnants of the oil out. As you can see, there's only about 2 tablespoons of oil in there, which is definitely not enough. Right, so the next thing I want to do is remove the conrods and pistons from the machine. Bit of trusty old WD-40 or similar, sprayed into the bearing surfaces there. The front conrod was actually free and good. It was this one over here that's seized up. As you can see, as I turn the main shaft, it kind of runs with it, which isn't right. It should be loose like the other one in the front. So just slightly exercising that one to try and get it to free up a bit. As you can see, it's kind of freeing up there now. Some of them are worse than others. And whilst doing that, just be careful that the pistons don't grab onto the cast sump casing and damage them. So using an Allen key on a socket, I'm just undoing the main bolt that holds the conrods onto the crankshaft. Just one thing to keep in mind here is the main bolt is actually a left-handed thread, so you are turning in a clockwise direction to loosen, and then the conrods simply slide off. And then I sprayed a little bit of WD-40 into Sean's face over there. He wasn't too happy, but he survived the ordeal with a smile on his face. Right, so here just exercising it slightly more, getting it a bit looser. It's pretty easy to do when it's still on the main shaft, so you got a lot of torque. So removing the circlip that holds the gudgeon pin in place on the piston, and gently squeeze it in, pop the gudgeon pin out, and there comes the piston. So now you have just the conrod in place. Right, so here now you've actually got access to the main bolt that holds the crankshaft onto the motor shaft, and that is, I believe, just a normal right-hand thread, so you can turn it anti-clockwise to loosen. And it's an Allen key head as well, and it's actually, the crankshaft is fitted onto the motor shaft with that bolt, and it's got a slit in it, and that slit tightens up as you tighten the bolt up. So I'm just using a flathead screwdriver just to open the slit up ever so slightly, and then it simply slides off. You'll see the slit in it over there. So now that it's loose, you can take it to the vise, and we can start loosening it off. Something to bear in mind is that it's probably, I mean, you could just chuck these 2 parts away and put a new crankshaft on, but in this case the crankshaft was actually a really mild seizure, and the crankshaft was reusable. I want to save the customer some money, so we just cleaned it up a bit, and job was good. add a little bit of heat to the aluminium conrod, and it helps it slip right off. Yeah, so what happens when it seizes, the aluminium actually starts to melt and deposit itself onto the steel crankshaft. So we need to remove and clean up the crankshaft mating surfaces so that it's got a nice smooth surface for the conrod to roll around on. So this is just about to pop off. The heat works really well for this sort of thing. There we go. It's off. Just having a quick look at it, seeing how bad the damage is. And yeah, I've seen a lot. I've seen ones that have actually broken the conrods. And this always happens when there's no oil in it. I mean, you know, you've got to check your oil, guys. You know, if you're using it every day, you should check it every couple of days. You've got to keep that oil right up there, just above the red dot on the sight glass window. You know, I like to keep it right at the top, the small air bubble showing through. Then you know you're safe. So just using a small file, very gently, to run over the aluminium deposits on there. As the aluminium is a lot softer than the steel, you can get away with gently using the file on there just to get the most of it off. And here a little bit of WD-40 and a bit of 800 grit sandpaper. Similarly over here, 800 grit, just getting on a vise and rolling it around a bit. And that's good. Cleaned it off really nicely so you don't leave any sandpaper deposits or any filings on there. And it was really clean. Popped it back on, gave the main shaft a bit of a wipe down. You want that bit to be dry where it mates on there. So that pops on over there, and tighten the crankshaft down onto the motor shaft. Use a fair amount of force because you don't want this to slip at all, because then your compressor just will not work. I couldn't give you a torque setting. I would say about 50 Newton meters, somewhere around there. Nice and tight. Add some oil to the main shaft there, the crankshaft. Sean went and got a pair of new conrods. You can't reuse those once they seize. They are absolutely, most positively door stops. So here are the new conrods, giving them a bit of an inspection, and then wiping the bearing surfaces down. Probably best to use a lint-free rag, but it's not mega critical. Just adding a bit of oil to the surfaces there. Pop the conrods in. They don't have any orientation, as they're symmetrical. You can see the little pins at the bottom of the conrods. Now what they do is actually pick up the oil when they go down, when they revolve down into the oil at the bottom, and they just spin. They spin up oil all up through to the top of the gudgeon pins and along on the mating surfaces, and just make sure everything's nice and lubricated. They're really important. If you don't have those pins there, it's not going to work. And it's a lot cheaper than an oil pump, like as you would have on a car. So here we're tightening up the main shaft. I'm just holding the other side of the shaft with the vice grips just to keep everything in place, so I can tighten the crankshaft down. So It's a reverse thread, as said before, so you need to turn it in an anti-clockwise direction to tighten. And similarly here, probably about 40-50 Newton meters, something like that. Never measured it, but just snug it up really well without stripping the thread. And there we go. Giving the pistons were fine, so we reused them. No use in replacing everything unless they actually need to be replaced. This compressor only ran for about 4 or 5 minutes before it seized up, so there's very little wear. Popping one of the circlips in place, and we can pop the piston in place. Bit of oil on the mating surfaces, always important, don't forget that step. And we pop it in place with getting the gudgeon pin nicely lubricated. Very handy to have one of those oil cans for this sort of work. There we go. Push the gudgeon pin in place. It obviously stops at the circlip on the other end. Just explaining to Sean over there how the lubrication system works. Don't forget to put the other circlip in to lock that piston in place. If you don't, what can happen is the gudgeon pin can actually start scoring the inside of the cylinder. Pop it in place. Make sure it's seated into the groove correctly as well. That's very important, because if it's not seated correctly, it can pop out. Adding the cylinder, putting the cylinder back in place, giving it a good wipe down, making sure there's no trapped dirt on there. Add a little bit of lubrication to the cylinder bores, always a good step to do. You want to wipe that right all over around the bores. And this part can be a bit tricky, but it's not too difficult. The cylinder's actually got a slight taper on the end, so that helps start it off. So what you do is you squeeze the rings, you compress the rings with your fingers, and then gently slide the cylinder over the rings. Just take your time with it and be gentle, because you can actually break the rings when you're doing this if you're not gentle. And it needs to, once it's in place, you will feel if it's correct. It needs to rotate in there really smoothly. If it feels really tight, you've done it wrong, you've probably broken a ring. So you would need to replace the piston and the rings, more than likely. So that cylinder's on. Sorry about the bad view here, guys. With the old GoPro on the head strap, sometimes you don't know where it's pointing. So we're tightening up the cylinder here. Just using an Allen key, as it's probably the only thing that'll get in at that angle. Slightly tedious, but a lot less tedious than taking the head off. This is the other side where we replaced the head, which had actually broken, as mentioned before. So here's a new head on, and we're just tightening that up. You put a new head gasket in when you change the head. So here we just Sean's adding the replacing the pipework at the top. Snugging the cylinder head down. Again, no torque settings really. We kind of use, I would say about 26 newtons, 26 newton meters is good for that sort of size. But it doesn't need to be too tight. Just to compress the rubber gasket slightly in, just make sure there's no leaks. So you kind of go snug it down, and when you hit it, probably about another quarter turn or so, probably good. Yeah, you can see snugging them down. And we'll tighten that pipe work up. Now we're nearing the completion of the job now. A few bits and pieces to do, but pretty much there. Don't add any thread tape or sealant or anything like that to these pipe threads. They're actually fluted, so as you tighten them up, it compresses the flute onto the mating surface of the fitting, and that creates the seal. So you do not need to add any sort of sealant onto those threads at all. They are just sealed up naturally, which is great. Saves time tightening that up. Also, be careful. You don't need to tighten those up very much. Probably about 10 or 15 Newton meters. I'm not going to measure it with a torque wrench. It's unnecessary, but you snug it up by hand. As soon as it bottoms out, you probably add another quarter turn, and that's plenty. If it leaks, you can run it up to test, and spray a bit of soapy water on all the connections. And if you see a bit of a leak, nip it up a little bit more, and job done. Just replacing the fan over here. Use a socket to drive it down, just so you can see the recess for the circlip. And then we put the circlip back in place using a pair of circlip pliers, always handy for this job. And be careful, because it can slip out, and you can find your circlip 3 months later on the other side of the warehouse garage. Yeah, bit of a pain when that happens. Just checking the operation, turns really smoothly now. Adding some oil. Despite what the bottle says, Halford's battery top-up water, it's actually SAE 30 compressor oil, which we've got a big 50-litre bottle, and we decanted into the squeeze bottle. That one works really well, so that's what we had lying around, and it works great for filling up the compressors. So we're just putting the cowling back on, screw the thermal overload switch back on, and job's good. It's important to get the cowling on correctly so that you don't foul the fan. Plugging the compressor in, and try to turn it on. It didn't work. Obviously the fuse had blown when the customer obviously what happens is when they seize, the fuse blows, because the motor starts to draw a lot of amps. So we pop a new 13 amp fuse in there. Pretty simple job, and plugged it in, and compressor fired right up and ran up to pressure. And that's it, guys. Hope you found this useful. Get in touch on the comments section.